Hello and welcome to The Wide Angle, where we discuss classic and contemporary films and debate the issues that they raise. Today we're going to be looking at 3 eco-films that focus on the issue of climate change. They are climate change blockbuster The Day After Tomorrow, released in 2004, eco-documentary An Inconvenient Truth, released in 2006, and eco-docudrama The Age of Stupid, released in 2009. We are also very pleased to have 3 guest experts join us today. They are Professor Philip Hammond, Head at the Centre of Media and Cultural Research at London South Bank University, Dr. Hugh Ortega-Breton, who is Tutorial Fellow in Media and Film at the University of Sussex, and Ben Pyle, who is Editor of the Climate Resistance blog. But before we kick off this discussion, let's have a quick reminder of the films by watching a few clips.
We've found something extraordinary. Extraordinary and disturbing, that is. You recall what you said about how polar melting might disrupt the North Atlantic current?
Yes.
Well, I think it's happening.
The government has to start making long-term preparations now.
Jack, all you have is a theory.
It's been raining like this for 3 days now.
Mr. Vice President, if we don't act now, it's going to be too late.
I'm afraid that time has come and gone, my friend.
What can we do?
Save as many as you can.
The storm is just going to get worse.
What should we do?
I will come for you. Do you understand me?
It's like looking through binoculars, observing people on a far-off beach, running around in circles, fixated on the small area of sand under their feet as a tsunami races towards the shore.
101 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the hottest day ever recorded.
Of course, worried about global warming. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean...
Well, the process balloon is now going up foam box.
The question I've been asking is, why didn't we save ourselves when we had the chance?
It's so overwhelming, and the grief is it's profound.
I always want our place to be like in America. If you're living that kind of life, you just want to stay on earth forever.
It's a fair fight, and I hope you lose.
I feel really, really fucked off with it. Scare Mother Nature, and then she dares you. Go ahead, do it. Let's dance.
London is underwater again.
Climate talks at United Temperature. As US
we have past 2 degrees.
How the
Cannot stop runaway planes.
An ecosystem collapsing so faster even as it's today passing 4 degrees.
Come on, you stupid computer.
If you look at the 10 hottest years ever measured, they've all occurred in the last 14 years. And the hottest of all was 2005. The scientific consensus is that we are causing global warming. I am Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States of America. This is Patagonia, 75 years ago, and the same glacier today. This is Mount Kilimanjaro, 30 years ago, and last year. Within the decade, there will be no more snows of Kilimanjaro. This is really not a political issue so much as a moral issue.
The biggest crisis
in the history of this country.
Early this morning, Hurricane Katrina slammed into New Orleans.
From Paramount Classics comes a film that has shocked audiences everywhere they've seen it.
What are everyone's thoughts?
Well, they're very different films in many ways, aren't they? One's a Hollywood disaster movie, one's a straightforward documentary, one's a kind of hybrid of documentary and drama elements. But there are certain things they have in common as well as their themes. One of the striking things, they all use emotion to make their appeals. They all use a kind of a combination of a public political argument and a sort of a discourse of private emotional loss to try and engage their viewers, which is quite a striking and interesting thing. And we started wondering, why is that? Why is an argument that's ostensibly a public thing mixed in with, intertwined with a kind of personal story of loss in all three of these?
Well, Phil, I think they're both very interesting films and they bring the climate issue to a wider audience, but I do agree that it brings a lot of emotion into it, and I think it quite often exaggerates some of the points, especially with an inconvenient truth, and it kind of belittles the audience in a way, because it thinks that they can't evaluate the truth and can't form their own conclusions on the facts that are there.
They came out at a time that's probably the peak of what we might call global warming alarmism and panic, and you know, they represent very much a real effort to sort of push this into the public sphere. Another sort of facet of that, which I think relates to the emotions, they want to draw a direct line between the science and what they frame as the ethics of the issue. So that kind of short circuits past the political. There's a very sort of conscious attempt in each of the films to, you know, explicitly avoid political questions.
It's also very anti-democratic in that sense, isn't it? Because you get all these facts about climate change and global warming thrown at you, and you know, it's kind of like, well, sorry, the time for debate, the time for political discussion about these things is over, because the science says it's got to be like this and like that. One of the things that you write about on your blog, actually, Ben, about the debate between Franny Armstrong and Ed Miliband, where she sort of says that the UK needs to cut its flights by 95%. I mean, that's a big, big cut in lifestyle change that you're advocating with, and saying that there should be no like political debate or, you know, anything around this is quite, I think, quite big. And what I think is quite interesting, where you look at the sort of environmentalism debate and think this is much less about trying to deal with the problems of climate change and much more about finger pointing at our lifestyles in the modern world.
The thing that was really at the top of the agenda was really getting people to obey this idea of a greener way of life, rather than actually approaching any solution to it like through technology. So the very interesting thing about Franny Armstrong and Ed Miliband was that it was presented as this kind of antagonistic relationship, whereby Franny was trying to hector Ed Miliband into sort of taking what she called bold leadership. But in fact, there's a compact between them. It's just a show. Ed Miliband wanted it as much as Franny did, and that's actually why she went on to turn the film into a sort of what they wanted to do was create a popular movement called the 10-10 campaign, which where everyone signed up to this pledge. You sign up to reducing your CO2 emissions by 10% in a year. And again, Ed Miliband's own sort of attempts to sort of turn this into a form of politics preceded there actually being a movement that wanted it. So he sort of starts off with the policy, and then almost wants to go and form a movement around that policy, which is politics. It's politics upside down, basically.
But I wanted to go back to the point that the film made first. There's a particular emotional palette, if you will, to all three of the films. That palette is a very specific set of emotions such as regret, nostalgia, pain, sadness. So it's not so much that these films are using or putting too much of an emphasis on emotions, it's the particular emotions which seem to be driving the narrative and the motivation of the main characters, I think.
On the first time I watched The Day After Tomorrow, I was very young. I sort of thought, oh my gosh, I have to take action. Is this what's going to happen? You know, the world's going to end. Sort of, you know, I didn't have any research. I didn't know much about the topic. Have you found that with your students and with your colleagues?
That's the typical response, I think, and there has been some research asking audiences about how they felt after these films, and people do tend to feel like doing something. But usually, after about 14 weeks, people just forget about it and they sort of go back to their normal lives. So the kind of rationale for these films, certainly the rationale for Age of Stupid, which is to motivate people to do something, is probably only effective for maybe 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, I probably could agree with what you said, because when I first watched it, I always wanted to take action. I was like, you know, I need to do something. I think I even remember writing a report for school or something. But since I've watched it now, I'm older, and I saw The Day After Tomorrow, and I just thought it's kind of ridiculous, exaggerated, over the top. How did I even believe that?
The way it's often understood is that the kind of rational argument isn't working. You know, you can only go so far in saying to people, here's a problem, this is what you should do. It doesn't seem to gain enough traction to go anywhere. So a lot of people then say, okay, so what we need to do is engage audiences emotionally. And the way it's understood is as a kind of add-on to the rational argument. I think what Hugh and I thought about these films is that quite clearly it's not that. It's not just a kind of a bit of emotion added on to kind of push the argument a bit further. Actually what tends to happen is something more in line with what Ben said, which is a kind of short-circuiting of politics. So you end up not actually making kind of political argument. You end up making an emotional appeal or a kind of moral appeal, which is very much what Al Gore does. He says it's not a political issue, it's a moral issue, it's an ethical issue, it's something about kind of our personal moral conscience. And so that's exactly what the kind of role of emotion is in these films, I think, is it kind of substitutes for politics rather than somehow, as people tend to assume, reinforcing a political message.
What comes very much across from both The Age of Stupid and Inconvenient Truth is not necessarily just that they want to provoke their emotions in you, but they actually express their own emotions. Franny Armstrong, so it's like, if you hang out with 3-year-olds, right, if you say stupid, it's a swear word to them, right? It's like kind of, it's a really infantile, you're all stupid, you're not listening to me. You know, it's kind of shout at the world, and I think Al Gore's is the same. And so it's inconvenient, you can't have this, you can't have it your way, it's got to be my way. So it's kind of actually betrays a lot more about itself emotionally. And so that's sort of reflected again, I think, in this attempt to use science. Like, it's better at saying, this is the moral imperative, and this is what scientists say. But actually, if you counter that there might be sort of some other means to solving this problem, that they will say, well, that's just a technical fix. So they don't actually want to see any solution to these problems that they highlight. They actually want this kind of obedience from people. And actually, I think that sort of betrays that inability to accept any kind of alternative argument about the politics, policies, or science. Kind of actually betrays a loss of confidence in its own argument, in its own moral argument, such that it has to sort of say there is no alternative to these policies.
It's not solely because politicians have run out of meaningful ideas to communicate with people, but because there's a trust in emotional experience. It's considered to be sincere and authentic. And Age of Stupid attempts to do that by carefully selecting 6 different characters, different nationalities, different generations, different sexes, who all have their own personal, highly emotional story to tell. And the director sort of weaves these stories into a bigger argument, a moral, ethical argument about how we should change behaviour.
When I was watching the film, I noticed that the use of the emotive stories from those individual characters is almost deliberately used to kind of mislead the audience, especially just focusing on one story in particular about the Nigerian woman who was showing the film crew around this abandoned hospital that she said that Shell failed to develop. And it was kind of basically saying to the audience that, look, Shell promised to do this and this for this country, yet it doesn't really put the stories into context. It doesn't actually say that you know, this is not the responsibility of a business like Shell to actually develop civil societies. It's down to the governance. So the use of these stories are deliberately used to mislead the audience to believing what they're saying, that oil companies are the villains, you need to side with us, sort of thing.
Do you think the ends justify the means? Why is it wrong for Al Gore to exaggerate these risks?
You might say there's a kind of almost comical mismatch between the kind of apocalyptic message that Al Gore is delivering. It's almost too late, we have to do something now. And then what happens at the very end of the film? At the very end of the film, as the credits roll, there are these kind of helpful suggestions for what you might do. So you can change your light bulb and things like that. They're all like very small scale, very individualistic. It's almost like you have to adopt the kind of correct ethical code of behaviour. So I don't actually think it's about what it appears to be about. It appears to be about perhaps, you know, a bit of fire and brimstone preaching to get us to all kind of change our ways because there's some impending catastrophe. Yes, it's about getting us to change our ways, but I think it's more, I think there's two ways you could look at this thing we've discussed about the kind of emotional appeal in these films. You can look at it from the point of view of elites and campaigners. What are they actually doing here? Okay, so what they're doing is they are using an emotional appeal, often an emotion of fear as well as of emotions of loss and nostalgia for something that we've used to have, as we talked about. They're using that as a kind of substitute for political argument. They're saying, here's a kind of moral message, or Al Gore actually says this explicitly, that he needs to kind of restore a sense of mission, a kind of giving us a sense of purpose for the elite. And I think that's why you have things like what Ben mentioned about the kind of 10-10 code. You have this peculiar situation where politicians are kind of trying to get popular pressure on them. They're trying to kind of create campaigns because they otherwise don't have that way to kind of engage people. So the emotional appeals are kind of part of that for them. But you can also ask the question, why does it have a kind of wider resonance? Why does it somehow work? Why does it, create these messages that we, to some degree or other, respond to? And I think that's to do with, well, it's a complex question, but I think it has to do with a larger sense of fear and risk and uncertainty about the future. Why do we have that uncertainty? Part of the reason why I think we have that kind of uncertain, fearful view of the future nowadays is precisely because we lack the kind of political framework to think about the future. It's very hard to map out a kind of meaningful horizon of what the future might look like in the kind of traditional political terms that might have applied in the past. A good example, I think, is the Day After Tomorrow, where it's got all those conventions of the classic Hollywood disaster movie. What's it about? It's about the hero's personal relationships. So the Earth kind of sorts itself out. It sorts out the politics. It reorders the world itself. It reorders the human world. Meanwhile, what does the hero do? All he does is kind of repair his family relationships, reunites with his estranged wife and teenage son. Something very similar going on, I think, in the other films too. The Al Gore message is, go home and change your light bulb. This is about my personal moral code and my relationship, my relationship with my son and the story of my sister who died and that kind of thing. It's about a personal coping with the big problems that face us, rather than tackling them. And it's inherently an anti-political argument, rather than that somehow just being a clumsy way of making it. I think your question was something along the lines of, isn't it fair enough to overstate the argument because if the problems are so bad? Well, first of all, I don't think we're in a position to judge anymore exactly what the scale of environmental problems is, because the waters are so muddied by this highly kind of moralistic discussion where no one is allowed to question or debate it rationally. But let's assume the problems are terrible, that we have to deal with. Well, why aren't we ambitious? Why don't we think big? Why don't we think big scale? These films aren't saying that to us at all. They're saying, don't think big. politics doesn't work. Just concentrate on the local, the personal. And that to me is not a good message.
I totally agree. We should be focusing on progress and how on advancement, scientific advancement. And one of my problems with Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth is that despite the fact that we know that there are errors in his movie, and I think I recently read somewhere that there's 25 errors, and despite that we can still use it for educational purposes. So what are we teaching the next generation? We're giving them information that's incorrect, and we should be focusing on how we can progress and how we can advance, and this is what and give them the tools so they can do that and, you know, make the change that we need.
Is it not plausible that people can watch this and be inspired by it in a positive way, regardless of the message, focusing on the little things?
I think in The Age of Stupid there's an explicit argument against the idea of techno-fixes, so that you can't really approach this in any other way than by reducing your levels of consumption and reorganising society. And that comes back to your point, I think. So you're saying the ends justify the means, right? So to save the planet. Well, it's not a situation where it's climate change or we die, right? You know, we can accept that climate change or any environmental problem is a problem, but the degree to which it has been stated is ridiculous, especially in these films, right? So you can say, well, maybe climate change is a problem 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 200 years in the future, which we must sort of listen to, and we must sort of do something about. But it's focused on the immediate and it's overweening. That's the problem, right? Because it's saying there's no other way in. Well, I believe there is some climate change, and I think there will be a problem.
But if it creates awareness and creates, a community of people who are passionate enough to want to look for that change in terms of technologically, do you not think it's possible to have a positive influence on people?
I don't quite buy it, I have to say. I think that if you look at the three films altogether, actually the message that we're getting here is not a kind of optimistic, hopeful one about the future. In fact, what they tend to do is imagine how the future will view us and put have a negative verdict on what present society is like. And in the other two films, not Al Gore's one, the other two, they actually dramatise the kind of apocalyptic, end-of-the-world type scenario. I think what's going on is something like what Ben mentioned earlier, a kind of short-circuiting of politics. It's what Mike Hume, who's a climate scientist, in fact, calls climate reductionism, where you say the climate will force what's going to happen, or the science, in Al Gore's case, will force what's going to happen. We're not in control of it. That's the exact problem with this message that these films are conveying. It's not saying, here you are, take control of your future. It's saying something else is in control of your future. It's the climate, or it's the science that tells you what you must do. So I don't think they're capable. I don't think it's a message that's capable of doing that, even though you're right, there are kind of hints that they would like to do it.
Al Gore was saying that CO2 in the last 15 years has increased dramatically, and that is true. So what we have to realise that this is a political message, but it actually has some good in it, and we tend to overlook the goodness in the film because we think, oh, this is Al Gore, he's a former president, he's doing this, that for his own gain. But if you were to actually break down the film, you will see that, yes, there are some truths to it, and the next generation should be aware of this, because they are the future and they have the brains to maybe change climate, put a stop to climate change if it exists.
I think you've got to be careful about what it is you're asking people to be aware of. If you want people to be aware of the environment and you want people to think that their futures are determined by what the climate will do, then you're actually disarming people about their own futures.
You know, all of these things are just kind of a more repentance kind of thing rather than actually doing something about if climate change is happening. And I would say if things are getting really, really, really terrible in terms of climate change, then surely the solution to that, if you were interested in the solution to that, would be to innovate, to develop and to just intervene on the natural environment far more than you're doing at the moment. Surely that's the way to mitigate any kind of disaster, than to cut back, because what are you going to do by cutting back? You're going to, there's no interest about people having a good life. The only thing you're basically saying is that we, as a human community, should simply focus on surviving.
I think the Age of Stupid does sort of try to make political points, and it's really telling the way it tries to do it. It does it with cartoons, often narrated by by kids. And I think if you're going to make a, you know, if you're being taught a history lesson, and it's in the form of a cartoon, you're kind of having your leg pulled. Right? And if it's a kid narrating it, it's happening twice, right?
The child is like a key signifier in the whole climate change debate, because it's about, you know, are you going to ruin the planet and not think of the next generation?
I think the film is almost looking at the audience as if they are children, like this is a history class or this is a science class, I'm going to teach you, and this child is like narrating it.
I think that the films actually assume that you would join their view of people as stupid. You know, the age of stupid means that they are impatient with and dismissive of stupid humanity. It's a really anti-human message. Of the three films, that's the most kind of nihilistic of the lot. It actually almost celebrates the idea of just kind of wiping the slate clean. In fact, Day After Tomorrow does something a little bit similar. It's like a kind of wish fulfillment fantasy, isn't it? It's like made by Hollywood liberals during the George W. Bush years, and it says, well, here's all these stupid people, right-wing people who won't listen. Wouldn't it be great if this disaster happened and taught them all a good lesson? And that's the kind of sentiment. It's a, as I said earlier, it's a kind of fundamentally anti-political and I think anti-human message that we get. So my feeling is not like, well, these films are kind of onto a good thing, but they're not quite doing it properly. That's not it at all. I think they've got a very negative message that I'm interested in, because I think it's something that needs to be challenged.
I think that, well, climate change is obviously an important issue, but I don't think it's the biggest issue we have out there. And like these movies try to make out. And so, and even recently there was an article how temperatures haven't actually risen as much as these movies are claiming, and they've actually stayed quite steady in the last decade. So, you know, that's interesting. So we should be really looking at technological advancement. That's what we should be focusing our time on. And as you said, not, you know, focusing on the emotions and the moral issue there, and looking at in the kind of in a political context as well.
Yeah, I think that although all three of these films, the subject matter obviously is catastrophic climate change, in a way they're not really about that. The kind of emotional appeals that they're making, insofar as they're successful or not, they're invoking emotions of loss in relation to the past, nostalgia for something we used to have, a fearful and uncertain attitude to the future. I think that's really about the kind of human culture, political culture that we live in now. Climate change just happens to be the peg that those films hang it on. It could conceivably be something else. So I think what's really interesting about those films and why they're kind of important to discuss is because of not the climate issue as such, but something else. It's the what they tell us about the political culture and what we need to do to challenge that.
I think they're interesting films to the extent that they are a sample of what people are saying throughout society. I guess you could they're no more coherent as films than a rant you could hear from someone at a pub, from an eco-warrior at a pub. They're just a sort of a download of what the processes that are going on in society at large and people's minds at large. And I think that they're valuable in that extent. They're sort of historical lesson. I think you kind of referred to about our political culture.
The way that change is represented, unfortunately, but that's representative of the current political period, is that it's something that happens to you. It's not something that you do. But if you do it, it's within a very narrow field. You know, it's within the family, or maybe just extending beyond the family. But that's the limit of what is possible in terms of social agency.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but we hope you will continue the debate by leaving a comment in the comment section below or through your preferred social media network. If you'd like to take part in the next Wide Angle, please email us.